I think I know which one is this. I think this is the right one. Yep, we got the right one. Okay. Hi, it's Charlie Zeese and Lisa Richards, and welcome to Pyramid Quest for today, July 27th, 2020. We thank you all for coming. There's some good news and bad news, what I'm going to be saying here in the next few minutes. This is going to be the last live stream that we're going to be doing as the Pyramid Science Foundation. A number of things entered into this decision by both Lisa and me. As I told you last week, I've decided there's so much information that I've been compiling from a research standpoint that I've decided to go ahead and write a book. And that's going to be taking an awful lot of my time, probably over the next 6 to 9 months to put that together. I'm allocating, hours every day to research and write that book during that time frame. I really don't feel that I can do justice to doing an hour and a half program every week to and do my book at the same time. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the fact that a lot of the people that we'd like to interview, people that Lisa talks to and I talk to, would all like to be on the show, but don't are working during the day. So what we're going to do in lieu of the live streams, we're going to continue to do videos, and they'll show up, obviously, if you're subscribed to the Pyramid Science Foundation. You'll get notified and ring the bell. If you're a subscriber and have rung the bell, you'll get notifications on all those. I think it's also going to be helpful for us over the long haul to do pieces that are of varying length. A lot of people don't have an hour and a half to devote to listening to entire episodes. So we're going to start doing some shorter pieces as well. So I hope people are not disappointed by this, but it was a good experiment, and I think it was a great idea. But with the book hanging now over my head, that's going to require an awful lot of my effort, and I'm committed to writing the book. And you're going to see even more reasons today as to why I think getting this down into a book form is going to be something that I just am feeling compelled to do, because there's so much in the research that I've been doing and some of the new research that's come to light in the last few weeks. So with that said, I'm going to let Lisa say a few things before we get started. Are you there, Lisa? Oops, it looks like Lisa's.
Thanks, Charlie.
Well, there you go.
So,
okay.
I'm excited for the. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, can you? Okay. Yeah, so I'm excited for the new. Okay, I'm excited for the new layout here, because there's so many different guests that we want to interview. There's a lot of different testing that we want to do that's going to make this more, it's going to make it work better for all of us in the end. I also want to put up some videos on instructions on how to utilize our products, how to use the capstone.
Oops, looks like we lost her. So I apologize for that. She'll be back in a second. But, Lisa and I have talked about this, just to reiterate. And so she's back.
I'm telling you, this thing doesn't like me today. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You were kind of fading in and out, and you were actually sounding like you were in slow motion before.
Okay. Well, I'm on my 4G now, so I only have one bar, so hopefully it'll hold.
Okay.
But mainly I was just saying it's going to be better for all of us. You'll have better quality information from us, more direct things, more to the point. I want to get some instructional videos on how to utilize all of our products, the meditation pyramid, the capstone, you know, the Apex amplifier, things like that as well. And then have some great guests doing interviews, guests doing meditations with us, you know, all kinds of things are going to be coming your way.
That's right. So we had previously mentioned that we're going to be interviewing Grandma Chandra next week, and we're still going to do that. We're not going to do that in a live stream format. We decided, obviously, to discontinue that, but I also think perhaps given the unique situation that she's in, that as a mute, that it might be preferable for us to be able to tape that and edit it potentially if necessary. So for those of you who are still interested, we're still going to do that interview, but it will not be live, but we will be doing that next week. So what I wanted to do today, I've got two things on the plate. Lisa's going to be doing the interview next week, so I'll have next week off pretty much. But I put together some information that came to me on geometry. I'm continuing to read Richard Merrick's Interference book. I finished it last Tuesday, and I've now had a chance to not only review his website, but I've found a couple of podcasts that he had been a party to, and I want to play one of those for us in this segment. It's an hour long, so for those of you who are listening, there won't be any real video with this. So if you have other things you want to do while you're listening, that would be great. But as part of the research I've been doing into Richard Merrick's work, as I was reading his book, started to read it a second time over the weekend, I figured out a new aspect of the sacred geometry of this Russian pyramid. I thought I had it all figured out, but I don't, or didn't. So I want to show you that, and I also want to show you some other phenomenal examples that came from Richard's work. He's working with sound and harmony, and I'm working with geometry, and yet all of these objects end up having sacred geometry, including the spires and so forth. So it's fascinating to see how his work and my work are starting to come together. I've written Richard, and I hope that he's going to be someone that I can interview as well in the near future. So with that said, I'm going to open up to the information that I want to show you today. I'm going to let me see if I have, it's okay. Give me while I pull that up. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it, Charlie.
Okay, thanks. Let me get to... Okay, so, today, again, what we're going to do, I want to talk just briefly about some new phi relationships that I found in the Russian pyramid geometry literally over the weekend. So you all have seen this slide before because I think I talked about it just last week, but this is a slide depicting the similarities between the Russian and the Giza pyramid. Now, what I figured out before, I knew that the slant height, which is going from point C to point F of the Russian pyramid for a base length of 2 was 4.236 or phi cubed. That I had already established, but I had never figured out if there was a phi relationship in the height of the Russian pyramid. And reading Richard Merrick's research, quite honestly, something popped into my mind, and I went back and looked at this last Friday, and I figured this out. So I already knew that the height was 4.116, but I could never figure out that phi relationship. Well, I figured it out, and what it is, as you can see now, I've added that into the top information here. 4.116 is actually equal to 2 times the square root of phi cubed. And I don't want to bore people with mathematics, but the cubing function tells me now that, reading Richard Merrick's work, that phi cubed is a 3-dimensional phi scaling. And so, not having known that in the past, I never quite understood how that all fit together. But essentially, again, the height of the Russian pyramid does have this phi relationship now, although it's in the form of the square root of phi cubed. So I thought that was important to bring to your attention. The other thing, while I was reworking this slide over the weekend, when I looked down to the slant height of the Russian pyramid and the slant height of the Giza pyramid, you notice that I call this the slant height ratio. So what I had been doing was taking 4.236 and dividing it by 1.618 to get 2.618. And then all of a sudden I realized something that I think is quite profound, and it may be worth a video. I think I will do one in the near future on some of these interesting phi relationships. If you subtract the slant height of the Giza pyramid from the Russian pyramid, you also get 2.618. I had never seen, and this is one of those unique characteristics of phi and why it's such a special number, I've never had a situation where I could divide one number by another and get a result and get exactly the same result by subtracting those two as well. So a fascinating aspect of phi and the value of phi and its necessity in scaling and the creative process. So these are the kinds of things that I'm looking forward to being able to do little 10 or 15-minute videos on in the future, things that you can watch and absorb fairly quickly. But while I've been watching Richard's video work in his book and also looking on his website, I found several other examples that I wanted to show you of the geometry of the Russian pyramid. We've done shows like this in the past where I've done this research, and I'm going to be doing this extensively in the book. But Richard has this on his website. This is called a Vedic stupa bell. A stupa is the top of the Buddhist temples in Asia. And you can see there that even this bell, which is an antique, I think many hundreds of years old, has this geometry inherent in it, just as the top of the Buddhist temples does. But here's a new one that I found on his website. I have not done much research, but for those of you who are familiar with King Solomon in the Old Testament, this is called the Secret Seal of Solomon. And I saw this again on Richard's website. And the one on the left was interesting, but the one on the right, I said, wait a minute, this looks like the geometry of the Russian pyramid. And sure enough, when I went to measure it, this geometry is there. So this is another piece of research that I'm going to be doing into the Seal of Solomon and determining, I believe this is called the Lesser Key of Solomon. So I'm going to be doing research on that, and I'll probably do a short video on that in the coming weeks. So yet another example of the phi scale, the geometry of the Russian pyramid, the phi scaling angle that I found. And then finally, in the interference book, he does one entire chapter on the geometry of the interior dimensions of the Rosslyn Chapel. and how they fit into sacred geometric principles. And this is why I'm so excited to get in touch with him, because he didn't mention the spires that were on top of the chapel. So when I went over the weekend to look for pictures of the Roslyn Chapel, I found this, and then I got some close-ups, which of course, you know what the answer is going to be. These spires have this exact same geometry. Now, this is a fairly blurred picture, but this was head-on from the previous picture and was blown up. The pixelation is not as great as I'd like it, so it's a few hundredths of a degree off. But I did find a separate picture, which was much more pristine and higher quality with better pixelation. And I was able to get the scaling, the angle of those spires to be spot on with the Russian pyramid and the phi scaling angle. So lots of stuff to talk about, and these are all the things that are exciting me to get going on beginning my book. So finally, one of the things that Richard's going to be talking about in the podcast today is the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake. And of course, we've talked about this before. All of the spires, the large ones and the small ones on top of that temple are the same geometry. So this is clearly information that's been passed on for hundreds of years in the secret societies throughout the world. So can't wait to start writing the book and try to tie all of this science, ancient architecture, research, and the like together. So anyway, that's the slide presentation for today. I'm going to go now to the YouTube video. I will put the link to this. It's actually a podcast, not a video, but it is on YouTube. In case people want to listen to this again, it's about an hour long. So we'll be finishing here, at around 1:20, 1:25 when we finish up with this video today. But I'm just going to sit back. I've listened to this once, and I was just fascinated with it. It's going to tie together a lot of the information that I think many of us know intuitively. Richard has researched this extensively, and it's just a fascinating listen. And the reason I'm going to post this, if you go on to YouTube, you won't find this for some reason. I found this video link on his on his website. So I will post it for you at the end underneath the video. So I'm going to turn that on now, and we can begin. Let's see if I've got that. Where is that? Here we go. This is one of the books that he has.
Today I have with me Richard Merrick. Richard is an acoustical engineer and alternative researcher exploring numerous topics including architecture, psychedelics, and the nature of human perception. He's probably best known as the author of both Interference and Man's Blueprint, where he explores the intersection between these various topics. Richard, thank you for being with me today.
Hi, John. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. So starting off, can you just provide us with a bit more?
Can everyone hear this okay?
Yes, we can hear it, Charlie.
Okay.
Information about your background and how you settled into your role as a researcher.
Sure. It's a long story, but I'll do it as quickly as possible. I'm an entrepreneur in the tech industry. That's been my career, primarily focused on the early multimedia and game development, graphics, some search engine development, and then various internet technologies. And started a couple of companies up over the years. And back in 2006, I decided that I was going to sort of get out of that world and focus on something that I had an interest in very early on in my teens and early 20s. I decided to return to that to see if I could determine if some of those ideas back then were correct or just completely off the wall. And what those ideas were was a geometrical approach to music theory. It was a set of inspirations that I had back in those early days, and kind of had to put them on the shelf in order to, make a living and pursue some other interests. But I always kept that early interest in music theory and music perception with me through the years, and started working on it full time back in 2006. Once I started working on it, I began to realize that there was something really there that had not been off base years ago, and I just didn't fully understand why some of the things that I was coming up with seemed to be accurate. And so I was able to, with the advent of the internet and research portals and various things like that, for scientific papers, I was able to begin to build a theory that I call interference theory, or harmonic interference theory, to describe how music perception works. And that led me into the study of the history of harmonic science, led me into merging some of those ideas with quantum physics and some of the latest research papers in acoustics, and off we went, and I started writing some books.
Your first book was titled Interference, and it did focus on this interference theory of perception. So can you elaborate a bit more on that subject and how your theory has expanded since you first published that book?
Right. Well, it's, if I had to explain what interference theory is, it's really pretty simple. It says that the same physics that are at work in music, or the transmission of music through the air, which is waves that are essentially interfering and creating these composite, very complex waves that hit our eardrum, that the same physics at work in that is actually at work in the formation of the human body and various organs, the human brain, the auditory system, and that in the simplest explanation, the human body and other life forms are a form of music. It's a interference pattern of resonating atoms, primarily carbon and water, that are creating certain patterns that are universal, and that when we listen to music or listen to sound of any kind, but music in particular, we're doing a pattern match of those interference patterns out there in the air with the interference patterns of our own physiology. And by comparing the phase shifts and the alignment of those, we're able to actually recognize musical patterns and sort them out in our auditory system and our brain, and are able to ultimately feel them and emotions. And so the theory that I propose is kind of a bridge. It's a theory that's common to both sound and the body and human life. It goes in different directions as a result. And I think this theory is, in some form, the original theory that goes back many thousands of years and formed a foundation for ancient religion. And we find a very heavy emphasis on music and its relationship to the body in ancient Vedic literature, the Rig Veda and Upanishads and things like that were developed since then. And that proliferated into all the various religions that we see today in one form or another, music being one of the foundational elements. Part of music is acoustics and geometry and symbolism, and the whole set of things comes out of this. And again, it all sort of, in my opinion, comes out of this understanding of nature as a form of music.
In reading the theory and understanding it more and more as time has gone on, I see it as kind of a merger of, you have Neoplatonism meeting this sort of newer field theoretical approach to understanding particles and matter. Now, that idea has been around a long time, but for a long time, the focus has been on particles more than waves. And so only more recently, I think, are people coming around to that idea, at least on a explicit level. So in that sense, your idea fits very well into what we're already starting to grasp about the quantum world and the subquantum world, about how these things are not really corpuscular, they're distributed waves, and they interfere with each other, and that is where we get your probability distributions. All the weirdness of the quantum world has to do with interference. And so in that sense, this is very much in line with what we're discovering in quote unquote status quo science as well. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And, by all the music people that I knew, they were just really put off by my use of the word interference for the title and for the name of the theory, because it sounds like it's a bad thing. If something interferes with you, it's keeping you from achieving something. And a lot of people think when it's applied to music that it somehow connotates something bad. But the truth of the matter is that everything, musical harmonies, disharmonies, it doesn't matter. Anything that is in the form of waves creates interference patterns. Now, the interference patterns, and the definition of an interference pattern, which is very important, is that it's a stable pattern. And so if you have a lot of chaotic waves and dynamics in a wave-laden system, and there's no reflection, it's a very broad spectrum kind of set of waves, you won't necessarily get, and probably won't get, a stable interference pattern. And so when we talk about interference patterns or any kind of theory around interference, it requires stability and order. Persistence is another way to think of it. And so the most persistent wave pattern in the universe is a harmonic wave pattern that's composed of a standing wave, a fundamental standing wave frequency, with harmonics that, quote, piggyback or emerge or heterodyne, there's various words that are used in science, off of that fundamental. And it's in that patterning of harmonics that we get stability. And out of that stability comes things like star systems, planetary systems, life forms emerge from that, crystals, any sort of orderly matter, it ultimately comes from some sort of containment field, reflection, resonance, standing wave, and harmonic formation. And so the fact that that's a universal system, it's universal to energy being contained in gravity fields within a spatial structure, within a field of space, and pressure acts to create these, to bring the order together, and within that, and then there's a set of physics behind that, and matter and ultimately life emerge from that. And so when we listen to music, we're hearing that order in our own body. It's not just out there, it's also inside.
Can you just briefly better explain maybe how do we get stable patterns in space? The space-time, when you think.
Oops.
Or what are the boundary conditions for these waves to actually form and stay stable?
Okay, yeah, so that's a big subject, and we'll start very simply that space is not an empty void. The idea that space was some sort of etheric medium or some sort of a structured medium through which light vibrated, for instance, was an old idea. It's been around since the Rig Veda. The Greeks, everyone just presumed that is what space, the ether, was it was some sort of a structured field. And then in the early 20th century, the Morley-Michelson experiment was taken to disprove it. However, in recent years, there's been very fine instruments that weren't available back then that are once again confirming that space is some sort of a plenum is the word that is better to use than let's say a vacuum. A plenum presumes some sort of a medium, and it presumes pressure. So space has fields of increasing pressure, and that's created by matter gathering together into clumps. And when it does that, it warps the field of space. And in quantum physics, so this is studied as the chromodynamic lattice, which is a quantum field that is cubic, generally is the way it's treated. And really, since the beginning of quantum theory, it was presumed that space was cubic, because meaning at the smallest level, each quanta is a cube in its fundamental structure, because the most stable atoms or elements have electron fields that intersect the corners of the cube. And the ones that are less stable have electrons that don't. And so it was presumed that this, the stability of the simple atoms in particular were dependent upon the corners of the cube. Now, you've got people like Nassim Haramein, whose theory of the quantum field is based on the cube octahedron, and that space breathes between a pure cube structure, and a dodecahedron, and in between it intersects this cube octahedron. And that's a likely scenario from what I've been able to study, and it's compatible with harmonic theory, is that there is this resonance of space, and that when you create fields of pressure, which begin with gravity around clumps of matter and are increased when you have, for instance, atoms of air, which create air pressure, and then you have atoms of water that create even greater water pressure, that the more pressuring fields and groups of atoms and certain elements you have, the more you create, at one level, you create spheres, and within these cubic fields. And then as something, let's say, in the simplest term, explodes or grows within this field, then it begins to assume structure. A snowflake, for instance, is under pressure. Water, as it's crystallizing, is under pressure, and because of the particular resonant properties of water, hydrogen and oxygen, atoms within a water molecule, as these become linked under pressure at a mesoscopic level and so forth, it crystallizes into a predictable shape. And so life does the same thing. Basically everything does, but it all begins with a structured space. It's cubic at its simplest, and that pressure forces atoms to align according to their resonant frequencies.
So a couple things. First, the concept of the ether, just in case people think we're spouting pseudoscience or something, there's 2 Nobel laureates that they should look into, Robert Laughlin and Frank Wilczek, and they speak extensively on space-time. What is space-time? What is the ether? Is it emergent? Is it primary? These are very serious questions in the scientific community, and they're not fringe ideas at all. It's merely a matter of interpretation. So there's no question that the vacuum of space is not a vacuum. Now the question is, what sorts of rules hold for it and all this, so you can get into the technical details, but the fact is it's there. And I think it's relevant to both human development, cosmogenesis, everything you could think of. There's a fractal structured order down there that the process is just ingrained in nature. I don't know how it got there, but it's there. And that's just fascinating. So to think from, the bottom up, let's start with the vacuum, and then what are the vacuum dynamics and how do we get to where we are? So it's a very reasonable approach to trying to understand how nature's working.
Exactly. I've been wanting to get some T-shirts printed up that say "Bring back the ether." I thought I could sell quite a few of them.
And I mean, like Wilczek and Laughlin, they use that word explicitly. They're not shying away from it anymore. It's just been relegated to kind of the back of the bus of science. It's always in the equations. It's relevant, but no one really focuses on it to the point where it's like, oh, can we engineer the vacuum? What can we do with it? How can we better understand it? So
yeah, it was so out of style for so long that some generations grew up feeling like it was verboten to mention or to even suggest it. And so much of the history of 20th century science, physics, was coming up with ways to talk about it that didn't necessarily infer you believed in it.
Right. Yeah. And
it was modeling. It was all about modeling, not about reality, but modeling somehow. So yeah, it's now becoming much more accepted. I don't think they've got it properly pulled back into the educational system. That'll still take a few decades probably, but if you go to some of the government research sites and you look at the papers and they're in high energy physics, you'll find it's all based on structured space. I mean, they don't mince words at all about it. They present rather sophisticated experiments that are based on it. So based on that presumption. So anyway, things are changing, but at the same time, we still have to somehow move forward, regardless of what biases may be out there. And for me, that means independent research and pulling together things that make sense. And I'm not really trying to convince the scientific community of anything. My interest is in pulling together some information to make people think and to change hopefully modify their biases and add some new thoughts. And in the process, they'll convince themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one more thing about the ether. Now they just call it the Higgs field, the scalar Higgs field that initiated the inflation of the Big Bang. It's like you said, it went out of fashion, and now they're just trying to find ways to incorporate it without saying, "Oh, you messed up." And
yeah, exactly.
And the last thing before we maybe move on to the next subject is your model also to me mimics, I don't know if you're familiar with reaction diffusion systems. Have you heard of those?
Well, to some extent, but in what way?
Well, reaction diffusion systems, in this sense, you could think of them during biological development where you have a mass or a chaotic system far from the equilibrium of, say, cells. One cell sends out a concentric between chemical signals that brings in more cells. And then you get these kind of interference patterns starting to form amongst the constituents of cells that are emitting chemicals and self-organizing. So I like to bridge the gap between your theory and standard science, the general systems theory, and reaction diffusion plays a heavy role in general systems theory. So I think you're taking the right approach, which is a general systems top-down. This doesn't mean tyrannical or anything. It just means the whole can shape the parts, and the part can shape the whole.
Yeah. Of course, all those chemicals, they're all, while they may be fluid and seemingly chaotic, there's patterning waiting to happen within any of those dynamical systems. All it takes is a more orderly environment over time, and all of whatever the resonant properties of the cells or the chemicals, all of those interact, and resonance is a general, as you suggest, a general unifying principle behind all of that. And all we have to do is look at the results, look at the structure of DNA, look at the structure of life forms and its many forms, and see commonality across all of those. And a lot of people point to, it's all because we came from some ancient core DNA, but that's not actually answering any question. That's just pointing to, yet again, another downstream evidence, a downstream product of something that was going on in a more primordial form before that. That's where science, especially evolutionary and biological science, tends to get hung up, is that they start somewhere above, they have some principle. I mean, evolutionary theory is primarily molecular. Therefore, they don't really have to discuss, what the effects of atomic level resonance or crystallization has on a cell's evolution. And by the way, there are obviously some well-renowned evolutionists that were cosmologists as well, and tend to see evolution as human evolution, animal evolution, as an extension of cosmological evolution. But Darwinian evolution to this day is very, very restricted to the molecular and cell level up, and really doesn't see itself within a larger context of cosmological evolution. And I think that's a real problem, because that keeps them from having to take into consideration some of these things we're talking about, such as, the structure of space and, how crystallization patterns from the subatomic and atomic level develop and would propagate into living crystals, liquid crystals, and so forth. So Darwinian evolution is correct to an extent, but it's incomplete. And so some of what I've been working on has been taking you in that direction as well, that, okay, we need to enhance the theory of evolution in order to be able to answer many of the questions that are separating, say, spiritual and religious concerns from the scientific community. There is a schism there, and it developed historically, but it's time that it needs to start coming together for people. I think there's sociological implications about this as well. And all of these in part fall out of an appreciation and understanding for the simple physics of resonance and harmonic formation.
The way I like to liken our view of evolution now is kind of our view of physics under Newton. So evolution, as we understand now, yes, clearly it's at play and that it's highly relevant. We're not creationists, but at the same time, it's limited. It has domains that it simply cannot explain. And so I feel like we need a kind of a relativity of evolution to come into the picture to provide a more holistic, nuanced version of what we're seeing in biological development. Because, a lot of really prominent scientists, physicists, biologists, I think the best book written on this is Brian Goodwin, called How That Leopard Changed Its Spots, where he basically argues that, of course, molecular DNA, it's important. It helps map out the particulars of an organism. But he goes on to say, similar to what you're saying, that the shape, the dynamics of the system, how the forces are playing with each other, that is what's leading to forming these dynamics, these interference patterns. These are environmental to a degree where, again, it's like the whole shaping the parts and not this little DNA mapping out all of your human destiny and what you are as a person. So I think moving away from that and changing our view to a more contextual, it's not a return to Lamarckianism or anything, but at the same time, it's we have to open up new paths, because Darwinism not only is limited to scientific theories, sociologically, I think it's limiting our perceptions of ourselves and what we're capable of.
It certainly is. And it's also heavily influencing people away from, taking anything seriously from the past, because as if all those millennia of wisdom gathering was just so irrelevant, because now we know things. And the truth of the matter is that we really blinded ourselves to some of the things that all these people before us had laid out, not necessarily in the same way that we would today, but they are pointing the way. And it's a little bit arrogant, a lot arrogant really, for modern science to believe that that everything before was entirely based on superstition and bad thinking. The truth of the matter is that every generation has had its Einstein, or its Max Planck, and they just said these things, and they gathered their information in a different way. They were much more based on observation than, let's say, mathematics and theory. It was very clear to them when they saw, the shape of a leaf, and then they saw the same shape in the shape of a beetle or human organ, that there was a relationship there. And that sort of thing is just and so there really is a revolution that has yet to come in science. And I'm not sure where it'll start. It might actually start in brain science, in cognitive science, but it's not there yet. It's nowhere there yet. There are a few people that are working on, for instance, theories of consciousness based on resonance, wave patterning, and that sort of thing, but they are very, very fringe and not accepted. Their papers are not accepted for publishing and things like that in the major journals. So there's still a lot of work yet to be done.
I do think it's pretty unfortunate that a lot of times we do turn our back on, again, what our forerunners have brought forth, the knowledge that they've accumulated, and we dismiss it as superstition. But what we keep finding again and again is that through our quote-unquote more sophisticated ways of exploring the world, we come to similar conclusions. So, the idea that everything's connected, very old idea. It's been borne out by quantum physics, chaos theory. The world is not divided particles that have their own inner landscape and no connection to the outer world. So I think that's been misleading us mightily. And I think a lot of the pushback against ideas that merge ancient knowledge with more modern conceptions is that status quo of modern day science is hell-bent on pushing religion out completely, denying all forms of spirituality. And I'm not necessarily a deist or anything, but at the same time, I feel that's kind of a foolish agenda, and that's kind of an old prejudicial thing rooted in the old competition between the medieval church and the emerging Renaissance. So I feel like it's antiquated and it's no longer serving us to keep drawing these false distinctions. And really we have to lay the sins of particular belief systems, I guess, at the feet of the institutions and the people that propagate them, and not the fundamental concepts themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, a big part of the problem is that we just don't have very good terminology to bridge the gap either. I mean, religion is a word that has, I mean, it comes from religioning or relinking. So the idea that it came out of a desire to relink the word and the various systems, belief systems around that was based on the idea of wanting to relink, the human spirit or the human consciousness with God. Whatever God was, that, however they defined it, they wanted to relink. And so there's still a great gap or a great hole of knowledge in conventional thinking as to what relinking is and what it meant, and the science and the fact that there was actually a science behind it that became, distorted and convoluted and corrupted over time into basically political systems. And that's what the Roman Church became, as it became a political and governing system, and it still is to this day. And governments actually came out of those religious organizations and laws. Western government in particular developed out of the Roman Church. And so we're still living within an ancient, worldview, an ancient, Roman political worldview that was founded in religious belief. And that, unfortunately, was a foil to the early natural philosophers. And I say the early, there's many of them. I'm really thinking of, all of them. While the Roman Church was in control of much of Europe, but also during the Renaissance, and Galileo's story being an example of the conflict between, the rational analysis and exploration of nature versus what the church said was reality. And as a result, has ever since been huge pushback against the church for that. And yet, things like spiritual concerns, which again is a word that needs to be defined as the word God needs to be defined, because we'll often talk about God, and then everybody will have their own idea of what that means. And yet, we'll carry on conversations and have arguments about it. So defining these words and finding links between them is something that, there's a number of researchers these days that are dedicating themselves to that. How should we define these terms in ways that the scientific community can begin to latch onto or at least appreciate? So my interest in harmonic science and music theory led me to study the historical development of what would be called harmonic science, or really the study of harmonics in nature, in music and in nature. And that led me right back to the origin and development of religion. And what were the temple builders doing? Why did they build temples in the first place? What was the purpose of the sacred geometries that they began to use, and the symbolisms? And so there's a whole collection of things that all intersect harmonic theory that lead you in the direction of the evolution, development of religion. That is what I pursued, and it was my third book, actually. This is my second fully published book. That's the Venus Blueprint. That was what I wanted to do with that area of study, was to try to understand, how did religion develop, and to what extent did musical theory or harmonic science influence that and provide a foundation. And I found a number of things I didn't expect to find when I started down that road. It was quite shocking, actually. And
your journey into writing the Venus Blueprint started with Rosslyn Chapel, right? Can we start there and maybe go into it from there?
Yeah, so while I was writing Interference, I was looking for ways to explain some of the concepts to people that weren't necessarily, purely technical, things that they could, appreciate and relate to. And one of those was Rosslyn Chapel. And what happened there was I saw a press release come out, and I guess it was in 2004 when the press release came out that said that a father-son pair over in Scotland had decoded music that was carved into the arches of a 15th century Roman Catholic chapel in Roslyn. That's the Roslyn Chapel. You know, there's a variety of mysteries surrounding that place, and it was actually touched on at the end of the Da Vinci Code when they went searching, you know, for answers to the book that had developed up to that point. Well, you know, everybody knew about that, and so I knew what Roslyn Chapel was, but here was a press release that said that a real mystery kind of had surfaced or had been there and that had been solved. And what it was that it was Tommy and Stuart Mitchell. I still communicate with them, have continued to occasionally do, you know, research and things, or, you know, we trade information. I ended up going over there, flying over there after some preliminary analysis of the chapel from a geometric point of view and symbolic point of view, and found a lot of things that pointed to that chapel being a chapel to Venus, you know, to the goddess of Venus, in particular the Hebrew goddess of Venus, which was named Asherah. So I went over there, and they took me in and showed me, you know, around, and, you know, explored above and below ground, because it has a crypt below ground that's sealed, but they have a sacristy that's next to it. And I noticed, I mean, it's a beautiful place. Anybody who wants to just be completely blown away by what was going on in the 15th century in the early Renaissance should go there and look at this place, because it's a storybook in stone. But when I went down into the sacristy, I saw some etchings on the walls. And these are not carvings, but just like they took some sharp implements and etched some drawings. And some of it was astrological or astronomical, little stars and things like that, little pentagrams indicating certain stars and places. And right across from where the opening of the crypt would be, if it weren't sealed, was an etching of a tower that looked like an oil derrick a little bit. It looked like an oil derrick or an electrical tower, which seemed very sort of out of place to me, very odd that there would be a tower that was carved in the 15th century that looked like something modern or quasi-modern. And so I took pictures of it, and from talking with the Mitchells and some other people, you know, nobody really knew what that was or what it meant. Well, when I came back home after the trip, I started, studying different things, and I started with this idea that this was probably a chapel dedicated to the goddess of Venus, you know, and that the planet Venus had something to do with it. And there's lots of other things about the chapel that indicate that Venus was a very significant part of it. I mean, Venus was the morning star and the evening star, and it rose before the sun in the morning, and it was considered the resurrector of the sun. And so there's a whole cosmology behind that, you know, that Venus was actually the thing that sustained the sun and that resurrected it. It was a sort of a mother figure. And so I started looking back into the most ancient history around Venus, and I found some scientific papers about Venus. Its namesake being given by the Romans was taken from an older name that was in the Rig Veda, which was Vina. And she was the sky goddess associated with Venus, the planet. And then when I started searching a little bit more, then suddenly I started finding these pictures or illustrations in ancient manuscripts of something called Mount Meru that was stylized into a tower in particular by the Jainist, which is a sort of a offshoot, I guess, of Buddhism and Vedic belief. And so I started turning up quite a bit of literature about Mount Meru and this idea of a sacred mountain that extends from the deepest depths of the ocean up to the sky and into space. And that the gods lived at the top of this tower or this mountain, or pyramid or temple or whatever word you want to associate with it. And that there was an entire cosmology then that was a fertility cosmology of the sun and Venus, and between them, having a sun, which is the moon. And so there's various deities associated with these, really through time. But if you go back, all of these astrotheological belief systems appear to be grounded in something close to what the Rig Veda describes. Well, I just started following that pattern of logic, and in the process discovering this very interesting connection symbolically, geometrically, frequency or harmonically between the patterns that Venus makes in the sky, which is a rose-like pentacle. That's the name Rosalind, which means is a reference to the rose. And I found this geometry in the organization of the architectural design of Rosalind Chapel itself. And what was a real surprise is, beyond that, is that this particular geometry, this rose-like or pentagonal geometry, when it's organized in the way that it was with Rosalind Chapel, you find a double square on the inside, and you have certain acoustical properties that correspond to that. And it has to do with harmonic science again. It goes back to how harmonics form and things like resonance and damping and concepts like that applied to a stone temple. And what you'll find is that this double square allows sound to propagate freely within and so that you can hear very well at the back of this such a building, such a room, a double square room, but that it won't echo because the diagonal of a double square is the square root of 5. If you know the formula for the Golden ratio, it's based on the incommensurability of the square root of 5. You cannot propagate then these waves. Waves won't propagate. They'll dampen and deaden in diagonal directions and resonate only in orthogonal or right angles. And so you create order within this sacred space of a stone temple that's built with a double square. And looking further, you'll find many chapels, cathedrals from the Middle Ages throughout England and Europe were double squares, and they were specifically multiples of 72 feet. And so there's actually a relationship between, the measurement of a foot and the speed at which sound propagates through air at certain temperatures. So there's more to the old measuring systems than a lot of people realize. It was very much had to do with acoustical properties and what's been called sacred geometry. And the sacred geometry fundamentally has to do with this 5-point star configuration. Within that, a double square that can be formed. And you'll see, for instance, the King's Chamber and the Great Pyramid is a double square. You'll find double square is used in all. It was central to Solomon's Temple, and thus you'll find double squares used in the Mormon temples exclusively, and also in most, at least classical, organized Masonic lodges, because both Mormonism and Masonry are connected to the legends and the various mystery schools around the Temple of Jerusalem or Solomon's Temple. And so there is this understanding of the sacred space that is connected to this ordering geometry of Venus in the sky, and it amazingly produces a sacred space that has certain acoustical properties. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Now,
Okay.
The question is twofold. One, where do you think this science originated? How did they figure it out? And then what were they using the temples for? And third, how do psychedelics enter into the equation?
Well, I think they figured it out and this is what I go into in the book, is that I'm looking for ways they figured. I think that they just looked up there. They traced the pattern of Venus over an 8-year period, which is its resonance cycle with Earth, and they kept checking it, and it kept repeating. So they thought, well, this is the pattern that we're seeing in the sky is that of a rose. And then they look down and they see the same pattern in a flower and a rose, and they say, this is a sacred pattern. So let us use this as a blueprint, what I call Venus blueprint. Let's use that as a blueprint to build our sacred spaces. And it just so happens, I say it just so happens, it's not a coincidence, a random coincidence. It's very much part of the story, and that is that the human body and mammals, organize in a fivefold pattern as well. So they're looking at all this and they're going, okay, let's use this pentacle pattern in some way to build our temples. And when they did so, they began to realize that they could create stone temples that had certain resonant properties that enhanced, for instance, chant or any kind of singing or musical performance within the space. That it would have certain, let's say, calming or certain properties on the human brain and their meditative states, when they would have the right acoustics for their chanting. And chanting began in caves or cave-like structures that were often tuned by carving a cave out or placing objects in different places, and they could match the cave with their resonant tone. And there's some examples of that. But ultimately, they came out of the cave and began building their own stone caves, if you will, that were more geometric and more specifically engineered to modify human consciousness. Okay, so, this process was kind of probably, much like other things in science, they observe and then they reproduce and experiment, and then they start discovering properties and fine-tuning that and improving it and embellishing it. And that's where the temples sort of came from. They originated in the Vedic stupa structure. And so all of the domes and bell towers and things like that you see in both religious buildings and government buildings, in many town squares, all are Vedic stupas. And they're all based on this cosmology that is laid out in the Rig Veda. So even the most Christian cathedrals are really Vedic in their origin and meaning. But of course, the more we got into the 20th century, the more we forgot what a sacred space was. And now we have auditoriums and churches and things that are developed that aren't really sacred spaces in the ancient sense of the word. They're not acoustical. They don't enhance resonant chant or music in any way. And they're really just to fit as many people as they possibly can into a space and preach. It's not about actually having personal revelation. So that brings us to your last question, I think. It has to do with psychedelics, which seems to come out of left field. And that was one of the things that was shocking to me as I began to ask the question, well, if they're using music and acoustics and harmonic science to modify human consciousness, and there are certain frequencies that do that. We don't have time here, I don't think, to go into it, but there are certain frequencies and certain tunings of a space, of a sacred space, that will enhance meditative states and induce meditative states. I began to say, well, what else were they doing in this space in order to modify their consciousness? And the minute you ask that question, then you immediately start looking at the communion drinks or breads that would be taken as part of these religious ceremonies and rites. And to this day, we still have communions in Christian churches, but of course it's either grape juice or wine. And if you go back far enough, and you don't have to go that far in the Middle Ages, you began to start seeing that, they were actually using some sort of entheogenic or psychoactive substance to induce visions. And but this is what was going on in the temples. You find Roman Mithraeans, for followers of Mithras. They even had stone tubs along the edge filled with salt water, and they would take the offering for Mithras, and it would be a psychoactive drink, and they would literally get in the salt water and float and have a psychedelic experience, see into heaven, and so forth. And you trace it further back, you find it through Babylon and Egypt, and you find it in all of the ancient religions. And you go back into, you look at the Rig Veda, and you find that Soma, which was the elixir of the gods, was a central element to Vedic cosmology and Vedic religion. And so the idea was they would take the communion of the teacher plant or the plant god, and it would allow their consciousness to leave its body and visit the gods in the sky. And that is the fundamental pattern of religious rites and belief systems that have been repeated in many different ways over the millennia. At the bottom of it is this use of plants or fungi to provide a bridge between, or to relink human consciousness with the sun, or more specifically the energy that the sun represents, which would be God. So resonance was kind of an inside and outside thing. You take the communion to sort of resonate, wake up the energy in your body. The Kundalini serpent would rise up through the body, through the chakras and into the brain and out the crown of the head, or the Ushnisha, as the Buddhists would call it, protuberance. And this inner resonance would then be further controlled or enhanced by the use of outer resonance, which would be chant and perhaps music within a resonant chamber, which are these temples and chapels and so forth. Rosalind was the key for me to begin looking in the right directions. It does all of these things and more. It's like a compendium of all the religious rites and symbolisms of all times just put into this one, carved into this one stone chapel. And so it's a very good reference for us to link our modern way of thinking through a 15th century, medieval chapel, Christian chapel, which was really a front for a very ancient temple rites that go back to pre-Christian times.
I think it's both funny and tragic at the same time that here we have pretty good evidence that entheogens, psychedelics, that whole experience is possibly at the root of not only the evolution of human consciousness, but also the development of Western civilization as we've come to understand it in North Bay. And we've since completely turned our back on that idea. And now we outlaw these technologies as class 1 narcotics, and no one can gain access to these, tools, you would say, of self-discovery, self-awareness. That's all they are. They're technologies. They're tools that can help us enter a different state of mind, enter a different type of consciousness. And we all know that consciousness precedes all physical action. Thought leads to action. If you're grounded in a certain way of thinking, and you've never done any self-analysis, and you've just kind of focused on the external, well, then you're going to create what we see all around us, and it's disastrous. But the people that are self-aware and done some self-analysis, sometimes with these technologies, sometimes without them, I think you get into a better space, and I think society would benefit, if nothing else, maybe a little bit.
Yeah, there's dangers inherent in taking psychoactive substances. So some people can't deal with it, and others can. And that was never a problem prior to the past 50 years, I guess. I mean, there was a certain amount of risk that was assumed in just being alive. I guess in the past, let's say 1,500 years, the suppression of the use of psychoactive compounds in religious settings was very largely the result of the Roman Church outlawing psychoactive communions in around the 5th century, pretty much right after the fall of the Roman Empire. Early Christianity was competing with other mystery schools, the worship of Sybil and Attis, as well as Mithras. Both of those were very popular, and much more popular than Christianity in Rome, for instance, at that time. And by outlawing the use of those psychoactive communions, they were eliminating the core of those religions, and they died out pretty quickly. That combined with some force, it was very effective. And so it was, over time, the Roman Church, continued to, they just saw no value at all in letting individuals have any kind of direct revelatory experience. And it didn't really start, we could blame it all on the Roman Church, and certainly they deserve a lot of that, but it didn't just start with them. I mean, the Hebrew priests were outlawing the use of psychoactive compounds, somewhere around, I think they, from what I've been able to find, somewhere around between 300 and 400 BC, they began restricting the use of those kind of compounds or plants and so forth for the priests, and then ultimately for just the high priest. And only once a year during Yom Kippur would those be used. So there's been a tendency for the priestly class to want to keep all of that's magic stuff secret, and for the laity to just depend upon the priest to tell them what they see. And that developed ultimately into the holy books, like the Quran or the Torah, the Bible, being that revelation, all of those visions that these different people had, and they compiled together and that have been selected and edited out over time as being sufficient, and that people no longer need to have those kind of direct revelatory experiences if they just believe, in this particular faith. Same thing, though, for Hinduism and Buddhism. I mean, yes, there's still some Vedic priests that are doing some, some sort of psychoactives at times, certain times of the year, certain rituals. And, there's even some Zoroastrians that are doing it as well. But it's not, even within those communities, it's not well understood or acknowledged. It's pretty much kept secret.
And yeah, like you said, this goes pretty far back. Instance that comes to mind is the Elysian Mysteries, where they would have that festival every year. It was basically, I think, invitation only. Well, a lot of people were able to go, but only a few people were able to go, into the cave to see special, whatever was in there, whatever rites were being done. So
yeah, they used a substance, or they used something called Pythion in the Elysian Mysteries. And there's the Dionysian Mysteries, which was the Bacchanalia. I mean, these people were drinking, wine was a base, but they would add things to the wine. They would create special elixirs for different occasions and different initiations. But this kind of thing was going on even through the Middle Ages. The Cathars had something called the Consolamenta that they would give to initiates and also the people when they were dying. And they believed that to not have the Consolamenta drink when you're dying was a blasphemy, that they felt that it helped put people into a state that would help them more easily transition into the afterlife. So that was very common, and up until the Crusades were launched against them. The Albigensian Crusade was the beginning of, eradicating the Cathars in Southern Europe, and this use of Consolamentum, the psychoactive revelatory drink or substance. So the fact that we're at a place today, like you said, where such substances are banned, both religiously, scientifically, socially, in every way possible, it's the worst thing in the world that you can do, was exactly the thing that the entire history of humanity relied on and was instrumental in raising interest and curiosity in things like the geometry of nature and how would we express that with numbers and so forth. How would we understand the patterns of the sky? All of those things were inspired by this desire to relink and have a personal revelatory experience where you can, see into other realms. So this kind of brings me to my new book that I'm working on, which is tentatively named the Vajra Sequence. This book proposes, it's a fiction, but it's fiction based on lots and lots of accumulated historical facts, scientific facts, and so I, like any good science fiction, I've learned as much reality and really just use the story as a thread to present a concept. And this concept is that science will develop into, at some point, I'm not sure how long it will take, but I feel it's inevitable, that it will develop back into what science used to be, which was rather than the exploration of the outer realm and the outer world, an exploration of the inner, and that is what you might call psychonautics instead of astronautics. And so I propose in this story, through the development of various characters, this emergence of a science that combines the ancient arts of consciousness modification, which includes psychoactive compounds, resonance, and so forth, incubation or isolation that's practiced in ancient times, with modern tools, which would be a combination of sensory deprivation. There's the Gansfeld effect, for instance, is a way of inducing visions using near static fields in your auditory visual senses, and a variety of other things. And I just sort of build this story up around the reemergence of this new sort of spiritual science that explores these other realms and actually increases lucidity and begins to communicate in a lucid fashion with other dimensions. And that's where the story is going. It's all tied in also with global political and financial activities because, like any good story, it starts simple and grows into a bigger picture. And so I try to take it as broad a vision as I can as to what the impact of such a birth of a new scientific field would be. And at the bottom of it is harmonics, the physics of resonance.
So I guess the last question I'd like to ask you is, what do you think all of this tells us about the nature of human consciousness?
Well, there's a book called The Physics of Consciousness that kind of has helped me pull some of these ideas together. And there's other books that connect as well with my own studies. And the way I see consciousness is probably like Tesla saw consciousness, and a lot of people are beginning to see consciousness, and that is that it's a process of resonance into the body, that the body acts as a kind of antenna or transceiver, the cell, an identity that is sort of, beneath it all, connects them with a particular body, with a particular DNA configuration that creates a receiver or transmitter, and that consciousness is non-local. It's just merely bundled up or focused through a body. And that's, this is speculation, but it's speculation based on both science as well as reports and experiences of many people. They either go through a very severe and advanced meditative process, or they take some sort of a psychoactive compound to an extent that they have visions beyond normal senses. And somewhere in science, these things need to fit. They need to have a home. They need to have an understanding and a framework that makes sense. And I think that what is being proposed these days, that a thought is essentially, or let's say an individual synapse spark, a spark across a synapse gap in a neuron, is a buildup of electrons or electron charge. And that these electrons are, they're non-local. I mean, they're popping into and out of existence. You know, some are more stable than others, but the buildup of charge is largely a function of non-local charges building and or not. And so if a spark across a synapse occurs, there is a very rapid but still variable process that's going on that involves or intersects non-local activity that we can't identify. It's not local. And so the question becomes, you know, are there quantum effects or non-local effects at work in the brain affecting thought and action? You know, maybe much of what we do is autonomous. It's based on the body responding to its environment. But this concept of free will or consciousness or identity that introduces more to, you know, that's the ghost in the machine, if you will, seems to be supported by the fact that there's quantum effects going on, and that as science continues to develop, we're able to find these quantum effects more and more, this entanglement and so forth, more and more at the macro level of ordinary reality. And I think that in time, that they'll realize that this idea of artificial intelligence only gets you so far. You can create a response-based system that controls a robot, for instance, so just a computer, and it interacts with the environment and can seem quite human. But this idea of non-local consciousness resonating into that is probably not going to happen until they realize that you need something like DNA. You need something like, you know, the transceiver effect that would occur in an organic life form. And when they finally get to that point, I think that's when the spiritual realms, if you will, are the recognition of non-physical realities will begin to merge with physical science.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. I think that's a good point. There's about 10 minutes more left in this piece, but this was a particularly important point that he was making. This was done in 2014, so it's been a while back, and I'm not sure if he was actually totally up to speed with Konstantin Mile at that point as well. But, you know, Mile is the one who has determined that DNA uses scalar waves as a way of propagating and receiving information and energy. So, but all of this information is so fascinating to me because he's picking up on the very same things that I've been discovering over the last several years, namely that there's been a suppression of this information through the church and through other forces. There have been other secret societies that have attempted to keep this sacred geometry and information about the harmonic nature of creation, of the ether, of the sacred geometry intact and passed down from generation to generation. So I just thought this was a really, really interesting interview. And again, I will post the link to YouTube for those of you who'd like to listen to this again or listen to the last 10 minutes of it. So, Lisa, do you have any comments at all about what he was talking about? I mean, I just think this, he's really touching upon stuff that we all have been feeling for a long time. I mean, we've talked about the dunce cap, for example, as a way that the Catholic Church has suppressed this geometry of the pyramid, and he's bringing up harmonics. And when you get into the book on interference, and I mean, this is heavy math. I was really good at math in high school, but boy, this is hard stuff. But I'm realizing that even the use of phi, the 1.618 that we now talk about all the time, was hidden in the mathematics of all of these Enlightenment scholars just to please the church, because they were told that they couldn't talk about the phi ratio in anything. And, if they did, I guess they were subject to, to death. So, I mean, this information has really, truly been suppressed for millennia, perhaps. So anyway, if you have any comments, go ahead. You're on mute, Lisa. There we go.
Hi. I was saying, just like anything with the government, if they suppress something, that means there's something to it. When I got into sun gazing years ago, I came across an article that said the church actually made it illegal for people to look at the sun. So that enticed me to look into it even further. It's the same with this type of information. The part that he talked about, this information was reserved for the priests, who would allow the people to go through them to receive, the healings or this and that. And that's how it's been for many, many years. We have control, we have the power ourselves to do all of this. And that's what you and I are here to teach people to do, to take their power back.
That's right. That's right.
So he had some really good points and some good information in this, and my brain's still going in all kinds of directions from it, but it was a lot of info.
And I've spent the last 2 weeks reading his interference book. But, the part that to me, and I think for most of us is the most relevant, is to see that it's the suppression of this information. And you've said it so well, that they wanted the people to have to come through them to receive, their healings and so forth. And even the information about that, which we are trying to provide to people, knowledge of this. You don't have to use it if you don't want to, but this is the ancient knowledge that has been
exactly
to be passed down for, thousands of years, and yet has been known for thousands of years. So, you say it must be good. And kind of reminds me of trying to get that quantum physics article from the Library of Congress on the torsion physics research paper from Russia, and they wouldn't give it to me, and I finally had to go to London to get it. If they're going to suppress it, I knew I was onto something. So, this is all fascinating.
Yeah. And what I love? I love too that he touched on the use of psychedelics and how that enhances your consciousness. I have never been into any of that. Just within the past year, I've tried mushrooms. I've tried smoking weed, and mushrooms is a totally different type of, it's amazing. It opens up the world and shows you how real everything around you actually is, how alive everything actually is, and how we're connected to it all. So just something as simple as that, trying a psychedelic for the first time, it's really going to open up your perspective to the world around you a lot more, and know that this stuff was hidden from us intentionally makes me even more upset, because how much better would all of our lives have been if we would have known this stuff a long, long time ago,
Well, that's right. That's right. And, I was brought up certainly I was in church every Sunday, and my concepts of communion were never anything like what I'm hearing from Richard. So, nothing to do with the stuff that we were told, apparently. And just to finish, I to state this, my mom passed away last summer, and I was down in Texas for her funeral in September, actually, and I asked the minister, he asked me what I did, and I told him about my pyramids. And I asked him whether he knew that the significance of the geometry of all of the steeples and so forth, and in Christianity, and whether they taught any of that in seminary. He said, absolutely not. So, continue on thinking that we have been passed down the truth from generation to generation, and obvious that we have not. So, you know, we all have to question more. We all have to think for ourselves in this world if we're going to continue to thrive and survive. So,
Exactly.
to use the art, this is going to be in the book probably, but you know, we all have to question more, and that's the RT byline. So, you know, I really like that. So it's going to show up somewhere. Maybe it's a quote for the first chapter of the book. But anyway, well,
Yeah.
we're at the end of what I guess is going to end up being the last of these for at least the foreseeable future. We do appreciate all of you for your continued support while we've been doing this. We hope that it's been valuable, but most important, I hope that you will continue to listen to Lisa's and my videos that we're going to be doing independently over the coming weeks, months, and years. So with that said, Lisa, do you have anything you want to say to end up here?
Well, I typed it into the live stream for all of our Pyramid Quest followers. I am offering a 33% discount until the end of the week, so until Friday. It's in honor of Nikola Tesla's birthday this month in July 10th. So the code is Happy Birthday Tesla, all in capital letters, and you get 33% off any order of $66 or more.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
But thank you everybody for following us. It's been great.
and thank you all for watching, and you have a great day.